Okay, so now I'm gonna sort of like roll us right into this first session. So we're gonna sort of walk through with you all some indicators of a racially equitable homeless response system. We'll start with some context. If you go on to the next slide. Yeah, so this is what we're gonna be working through. So we have for the past few years, honestly, and more intensely over the past several months, been working on a framework for measuring equity in your system. And we're going to this session is going to be kind of an introduction to that framework. And we're going to spend some time. There are 4 indicators, and we're going to spend some time with each of the indicators. Aras is going to kind of explain the indicator, and then we'll have some time to kind of answer any questions and sort of dig into each one at a time. And then we'll hear about some next steps and what you can expect from Built for Zero going forward. And these are our faces. These are the folks who will be working with you for this our next 90 minutes. We've got Aras, the portfolio lead for our data team. Caitlin, who's the knowledge manager. Many of you may have talked with her about some best practices. And then there is myself. I'm a strategy lead on the Built for Zero team. I also work with a lot of our communities working on a by name list.
Thank you for the thumbs up, Candace, modeling that use of those reaction cards. Awesome. Thanks for giving us that intro, Garen. So I'll jump in here. I think I know many of you, but for those who don't know me, as Garen said, my name's Aras. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I head up our data team at Built for Zero Community Solutions. And I'm really excited to talk through these indicators with y'all and to dig into some of the ways that we might start to operationalize. We heard yesterday, both from Ruby Sales as well as Regina and other speakers, how important it is to use your data. It's not the end all be all, obviously, but it's one tool in the toolkit for thinking about racial equity in the work that we do. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background. How did we get here? So a couple of years ago, as we started to focus in on this question of racial equity within the homeless response system, we started to do some piloting with communities. Some of y'all may have been part of those conversations. I think Erin, Julia, myself, and a couple other folks on the Built for Zero team were involved in what we sort of framed up as a data pilot around racial equity in systems. We worked with about 10 or 15 Built for Zero communities, and we really just wanted to understand what's the lay of the land, what's the baseline, what are you able to do in this space? And we heard a bunch of really rich feedback in that moment about how important it was to have a concrete, measurable aim, about challenges in understanding and communicating whether we're making progress. So are things getting better or worse with regards to racial equity? That it's hard to know if a change is actually leading to an improvement, right? So we've sort of framed up that there are some problems here that we hope to solve. Some things don't look quite right. We're going to test something new out. And then we're sort of stuck in a morass of disagreement about whether or not where we're at now is better or worse than where we were 6 months ago. Sound familiar? And that we're not sure how to hold the system and each other accountable for improvement. And for us, this was a light bulb moment, because honestly, if we think back 5, 10 years ago, these are the same conversations we were having about reductions and ending homelessness, right? So some of y'all will remember that prior to all the amazing work you've done to implement coordinated entry systems and to develop system performance measures and to report that data monthly and to look at your data, we were having these same conversations about ending homelessness. Are things getting better or not? We're not sure. Are we driving towards our goal? I'm not sure, right? How do we hold each other accountable? How do we hold ourselves accountable for improvement? And so this was a light bulb moment for us that this set of questions is a flag that what we might need here is a shared measurement framework for what does equity look like? What does racial equity look like in our homeless response system? And how are we going to track and measure that over time? So that was sort of the impetus for this work. And since then, you'll see, and those of you who were on with us yesterday will remember, there's been a lot of work. It's been a journey. So we had a first draft of this framework that was developed with a ton of input from partners and community stakeholders. And we had that, what feels like a lifetime ago, but is the last in-person learning session that we had last October in Denver. And hopefully some of y'all were there. I think it was a really fruitful event. And so we got a lot of feedback from communities on this framework at that event. And since then, we tried to go really deep to get different stakeholder feedback to come up with a revised version. So over the last 6 months in particular, our team sort of reached out to a lot of partners in the field, to experts in the racial equity space to solicit input on a first version of this framework. 4 communities had sort of focus groups with frontline staff. So special shout out here to Detroit, to Nassau, Suffolk, to Charlotte, and to Madison, who really piloted some of these conversations locally and gave us really great feedback that we responded to. And then we had 3 virtual focus groups with folks with lived experience of homelessness and wanted to get their perspective as well. And that happened in Phoenix, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. So thank you to those communities as well. So I say all this to say that what we're about to walk through is very much a work in progress, but to also help reflect that it is definitely not something that we sat in a lab, our team, and came up with. It is very much the product of conversations and input and sort of co-design with all of these different stakeholders about what would be a set of indicators that would feel meaningful, not just sort of off-the-shelf system performance indicators, but something that would be genuinely meaningful around thinking about how to measure equity in our communities. Okay, so here I just want to also pull up and say, obviously Community Solutions is not the only team or organization thinking about this, right? Your local teams, as mentioned yesterday, are often way more in the weeds and way ahead of where our team is on this. And we are excited to learn from and with you guys in the days ahead. But also there are some other great organizations in the homeless response space who've been thinking explicitly about racial equity. So I know our partners at the VA and HUD have done some thinking about this. We know that our partners at the Center for Social Innovation and the Spark work was a real catalyst for a lot of these conversations, right? We know that partners like NIS and CSH have put out tools or frameworks. But I think when we did an environmental scan, what we felt like was missing was an evidence base or a body of work that is focused specifically on the homeless response system. So we saw that there was really good tools out there for analyzing disparities in who's experiencing homelessness in your community, right? But we know that a lot of that story is about inflow, and sometimes that can feel a bit out of our hands, right? We also saw really, really targeted tools for thinking about specific programs or projects or agencies, right? And getting feedback on how is my, emergency shelter system working? Who's it serving well? Who's it not serving well? But we know that the story of coordinated entry to me is that we need to zoom out a layer from those programs and projects and think community or system wide about some indicators that can give us some common cause and a shared framework or language for rowing in the same direction. And we know that a lot of really good work has happened just since the COVID pandemic hit. And folks have been doing really meaningful work thinking about how to target CARES Act resources in an equitable way, right? And we want to build on top of all of that and incorporate all of that learning as we go forward. Okay, so almost done with this sort of background section, but before we sort of talk through the specific indicators that we think y'all may want to consider adopting locally as a way to think about equity, just want to talk about what's not here. So these are some limitations that we want to name explicitly. So I think the first one I just mentioned, which is that this framework is about your homeless response system. So we know that your homeless response systems, all of ours, are going to be inheriting some racial disproportionality from upstream systems, right? We know that Black and Indigenous Americans are disproportionately likely to enter into homelessness. But I think that's the hand that we're dealt, right? And we may not feel like we have control over that today, although I encourage y'all to think about how to partner with upstream systems to work on that. But with the hand that we're dealt, we have some control over what are we doing with that inherited disparity? Are we deepening it? Are we pushing back against it? Are we maintaining the status quo? And so that's really the focus of this framework, is thinking about your homeless response system and what are we doing with those potentially inherited disparities. Next, I want to say that these measures and indicators do not alone define a racially equitable system. So basically, this is just saying this is a start, but we're not claiming that this is the end all be all, right? And that we'll learn together and we'll evolve together, just like we have with measures around reductions and understanding the work to end homelessness, right? So this is going to be an evolution, but we think These indicators will evolve and improve, but this is a good place to start. Okay, I think that's enough preamble for now. So let's dig in. So we're going to walk through 4 indicators here. And for each one, you'll see that we've got what we're calling an indicator. So this is the concept, right? And I think we feel really strongly that these are important concepts. But then we need to think about how to operationalize them, right? How would you measure something like system decision-making power? And this is the place where I think our team is inviting y'all to sort of lean into this figuring it out together space. And you'll hear more about that. But I think the indicators feel like the thing that we are pretty committed to at a values and mission level. And then we want to start to lean into how do we operationalize this? How do we establish a baseline? How do we measure improvement over time? And that nitty gritty in the weeds work, I think, is where we're going to do a lot of learning and discovery together. So the first one of these indicators is about system decision-making power. And what we mean by that is thinking about who holds the ability to influence the design of a system in your community, and are Black, Indigenous, people of color represented in those key decision makers. So 2 ways that we think you might want to start to measure this are, first, looking at your formal decision and decision-making and design roles, and seeing who's sitting in those chairs, right? Does it include people with lived experience of homelessness, people who are currently experiencing homelessness, and frontline staff? Then thinking about who those roles and positions were designed by, right? So is it that we're sitting over here and sort of thinking about what would it look like to include more equity? You know, maybe we've got sort of the usual suspects of continuum of care leadership or your Built for Zero leads sitting together and thinking about, hey, how would we do more equity, entrench more equity explicitly in our system? Or is there an opportunity to really try and co-design those roles with the folks that we're hoping can sit in them? So obviously, again, this is not as cut and dry as pull a report out of HMIS and look at it month over month. This is sort of building a new or different infrastructure. But I think with that said, our hope is that y'all can start by mapping the existing formal and informal decision-making structures in your community's homeless response system. So one example of this for me is, what would it look like? What would it take locally to change your prioritization policy, right? Could we map that out? And I think y'all are experts in doing some process mapping. We've been using this tool for years now to think about what parts of our systems are working inefficiently, and then to target improvements in shrinking the number of steps in a process or reducing the length of time it takes. Same toolkit here. Can we start to map out what are the different steps involved in some of these big key decision-making processes locally? And then let's start to get curious, right? So who's at the table for those different meetings or different stakeholder groups who would be consulted? And then who's ultimately got the power to make a decision? Because I think that in a lot of our communities, we have these sort of advisory boards, which is a really great start and is not quite the same as formal decision-making power, right? So me saying, what do you think about this proposal? I'm ultimately gonna make the decision, is pretty different than saying, hey, you gotta vote and I gotta vote, and you're invited as a co-equal member of the decision-making body. So I'll pause here. I know that that is a sort of fire hose of information. Would love to hear in the chat how this lands for folks, whether you have any questions about it. Just foreshadowing that these first 2 indicators that we're going to walk through are the ones where I think we're going to have to stretch the most out of our comfort zones, because they're going to involve qualitative data collection and tracking systems, right? So it's not going to be that cut and dry, we've already got a system performance indicator that we can pull off the shelf. So I'll pause here. Garen, anything that you would add from the coaching perspective around how we think we might start to engage communities and support them in doing this work?
I was just typing something into the chat, so I'll just say it with my mouth. So yeah, I think like from what you just shared or us, I like just kind of felt an improvement question forming just about this difference between representation and power. So this like, and that is kind of, that's what this indicator is about. It's about power, not representation. So if I were thinking of like a change idea or like an improvement question, I would think about like, if I change representation, will it change the way power is distributed? And like, how would I know that power had been distributed in like a positive direction in a way that like includes Black, Indigenous, and people of color and people with lived experience.
Thanks, Garen. I'm looking through the chat to see if folks have any specific questions here. Sounds like there's some thumbs up around the use of qualitative metrics here too, and some questions about the slides being available. We'll get those out to folks. We've got a shiny PDF version of this framework that we're excited to share with you later today. All right. Well, I think that Caitlin on our team has some questions sort of preloaded here as folks are typing things into the chat. So maybe Caitlin, I'll pass it over to you. Any questions for me or for Garen around this first indicator?
Yeah, so I think one question that people might be asking themselves are how a community, once they map out their formal systems, do you have ideas about how they might go about making space within those systems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So at the risk of getting overly meta, right? One thing that we also need to map out is what is the process for changing some of these systems or decision-making structures, right? So this is where our governance nerd friends can start to feel excited and energized because I think that there are often going to be rules around what it takes to make a change to some of these formal processes and systems. And we've got to understand those rules, and then we've got to leverage them, I think, once we have an idea of what direction we might want to head in. And I think the good news here is that this is a place where I think we can tap into the power of our movement and our network, because I guarantee you that as we start to map out sort of these dynamics and system decision-making frameworks locally, I'm imagining a world where every community has sort of a articulated map of what it would take locally change your prioritization policy. Then we can start to say like, which ones of these look like they're pretty good and participatory? Which ones of these have really strong representation from these different stakeholder groups? And can we start to copy paste those rather than having to start with a blank canvas? So our invitation is to take that first step and then to be in conversation with us about whether you feel like this might be a place where your community is actually really strong. I think the nice thing about these indicators is as we walk through them one at a time, I imagine that your community is going to be at a different place in terms of baseline on these 4 different indicators. And so it might be that you feel like we've got a lot of work to do on some of them, but that there are some places where you can actually show up as the teacher, right? As the bright spot for us to sort of say, hey, look at what this community's figured out. Could we try and replicate it?
Awesome. And I think I've got to, go ahead, Garen.
I just wanted to add, I just wanted to maybe like reinforce with like maybe a specific example, something that Arash just said. I'm thinking of like, I don't know, I'm thinking there are so many, just from like the by name list perspective, if you were to just like look at the by name list scorecard and like think about just some of the policy questions in there about like implementing a certain policy, like if you were to make a change to your inactive policy, one, what would the process to make that change be? And 2, at what points in that process would Black, Indigenous, and people of color have decision-making power? That would be your baseline, I guess. And then you'd be looking at kind of like improving on that baseline. How do you change your decision-making system in your community to better incorporate that kind of co-design?
I think it's a really great example, Garen. I think the second question that I had was, could you give us some examples of what structures we could look at if people are having trouble trying to figure out what the formal decision-making structure are? Could you give us an example of what some of those structures might look like in a community? But I think your example of thinking through how a policy change might be made and who that needs to be run by can really help you figure out who those entities are in your community. So I think you actually already answered the second question I had. That's great.
Yeah. And I'll chime in here. There's some great conversation happening in the chat, it looks like, about some sort of HUD requirements around lived experience advisory boards or sort of the way that continuums of care are structured, right? And this is a place where there's definitely some expertise in our network. And I think what feels crucial here, and is part of the theory behind that second measure, and let me just jump back in the slides, that these roles and their selection criteria are designed with and approved by the stakeholders representing the target group. So something we heard really loudly from the focus groups of folks with lived experience of homelessness was that often they were being invited into roles that didn't feel meaningful to them, right? And so I think maybe a litmus that we might want to start considering is sure, like the on paper decision making matters, but also whether or not people feel like their voice is having weight and that they have input that is actually resulting in change also matters. And so as we start to think about operationalizing, I wonder if there's also something here around figuring out some key stakeholders who we think represent some of these often marginalized voices and checking in on whether or not we feel like the changes that we're proposing actually would move the needle for those folks, right? Because I think that I'll just own for myself, I'm probably not the right person to ask whether or not a given change with regards to COC governance is going to feel like it's a meaningful example of power sharing. And so we need to ask the folks who may currently be sort of boxed out of those seats of power or decision making in our systems, does this feel like it's moving the needle in a meaningful way? All right. Caitlin, maybe we could take one more question. I don't know if there's anything from the chat that's percolating or if there's something else that you think would be good for us to speak to here.
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, we'd love that. Thanks.
I work for a health plan, and it's extremely hierarchical, the corporate world, and it kills my soul every day. But what's sad for me, I love this. It's wonderful. I hope to import it into my domain. But what's sad for me is that it's the interlocking of systems, and I don't want to be a naysayer in any way, but even if this system becomes completely non-hierarchical, it will be interlocking with other systems that also need to change.
I totally agree and hear that. I think that often our theory or approach has been to start small and to demonstrate what's possible. So I think, an analog for us is when we started out some of the improvement work, we narrowly focused on veteran homelessness, right? Or homelessness for people, chronic homelessness, right? Single individuals. And then what we've seen that has been really inspiring is the ability to hold up system improvements and structural improvements in those sort of narrower spaces, and to see that they sort of catalyze an avalanche of change, or they can, right? And so my hope would be that by taking this piece of the system that we have some influence and control over, we might then be able to exert some pressure, right, on those other systems to say, why not make some change? Yeah. And not to say that it's going to be easy, because it's not, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take some rolling up of sleeves and some hard conversations. But I'm hopeful, cautiously.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. So maybe I'll move us to the next indicator. And then what I'll promise is that we'll have time at the end for some more open-ended and holistic conversation. Okay. So, but before I do that, I think we wanted to take a quick sort of straw poll here. So Garen, do you want to talk folks through it?
Yeah, so we're going to do this after each of the indicators. This was going to be like a Zoom poll, but it's not. It's a slide instead. And so yeah, I'd love if you could just type in the chat, how confident do you feel in your community's ability to implement, measure, and track this today? And again, this doesn't mean that you're doing it perfectly. It just means that you have a system to know how you're doing. 3s, 4s. I haven't seen anything below a 3. Ooh, I see a 2. Thank you for sharing. Excited to work with everybody on this.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think we have like lots of different levels of readiness. I think I think that's great. Like I'm excited. That means we have some people in the collaborative who have a lot to share. We have others who are ready to learn. I think like we're all ready to sort of make some connections. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think the second measure or indicator that we want to talk through here is about lived experience. So as I mentioned, these first two are going to be qualitative, and then we'll move into a more quantitative space coming up soon. So the indicator here is whether Black, Indigenous, and people of color receiving services from the homeless response system have experiences that preserve their dignity and have their needs met in a timely manner. I want to speak to this language specifically because this is one of the big changes, that adjustments that we made between the first version and second version. I think that for that first version, the language here on this indicator said that folks are reporting satisfactory experiences, right? Or it was something, it used the language of satisfaction. And we got a lot of pushback on that from focus groups of folks with lived experience who basically said, satisfaction is not the right thing. That's not actually the meaningful measure here. What would be meaningful is feeling like our dignity was preserved and that our needs were met in a timely manner. And obviously that's a no-brainer, in hindsight, I think hindsight 2020. But so we wanted to intentionally revise that language and to refocus on what folks with lived experience sort of prioritized as the meaningful measure of their experience of the system. And so what I'll just name is that I think a lot of us have some maybe outdated or off-the-shelf customer satisfaction or feedback surveys that we may want to reimagine or transform in some way, or revisit, spruce up. So two measures here that we started to think of. First, using some kind of data collection or procedure developed in partnership with a stakeholder group of individuals experiencing homelessness. So again, the idea is this is not an off-the-shelf satisfaction survey that we've cooked up in a lab. This is something that we've created in conjunction with people with lived experience of homelessness, right? So we're asking, what questions do y'all feel like we should be asking day in, day out from people receiving services that would help us know whether or not their lived experience preserved dignity and that their needs were met in a timely manner, right? And here again, like I think that we have lots of assumptions about, should we use a survey? Should it be a focus group? I think that we're trying to be agnostic as Built for Zero to say, we don't have the answers, that y'all are the local experts here and know way more about the contours of your homeless service response system and what's realistic and what's not, and how you're going to maybe be able to get more candid feedback from folks. But what we do think is a little bit more cut and dry is that if you don't, you have to have, we think, to get meaningful feedback, some kind of documented policy prohibiting retaliation against or delay or declination of services to anyone reporting unsatisfactory experience, right? That's one thing that we heard from folks with lived experience of homelessness, was that they didn't feel like they were being invited to provide candid feedback because they felt wary of retaliation, right? And so do you have something on the shelf that you can point to that says, like, here are your rights as you provide us with candid feedback, and here are the ways in which we'll hold people accountable if it does turn out that there is retaliatory behavior that's creeping into the system, right? And I think just being able to have those things and to actually be able to document instances where that's happened and that there was a response feels really crucial if we're going to ask folks to meaningfully give us feedback on their lived experience of these systems. Okay, but again, I think on these first two, there isn't like a toolkit or a scorecard that Built for Zero has that we're going to be recommending to you just yet. Eventually, we might have some templates from those bright spots once folks start to say, like, actually, this is a thing that our community's figured out. Our hope is to quickly be able to take some of those and share them out across the network so that we can learn from our peers. But this is a space where there's going to be some variation community to community. But we think that a place to start, again, is by inventorying what your community is already doing. So are there service providers or local organizations that are bright spots in your community? And this might be an opportunity to also look outside of the homeless services system to think about those healthcare partners, upstream systems. The youth space, I think, is often a place where folks are a lot more attuned to issues of lived experience than we are. We could learn from partners in that space. So I think there's learning to be done locally. And then I think, again, most of us have some version of a customer satisfaction or user feedback that we're doing already, right? And so rather than saying, like, let's hold on to that and then create something completely new, is there an opportunity to do a redesign or a transformation or a refresh on an existing survey or focus group or process that you have locally? And could we try and think of that as a co-designed operation, right? So rather than like, let's get together 3 or 4 smart folks from our homeless response system, maybe inviting in some folks with lived experience explicitly to be part of the design session for that survey instrument. And then lastly, sort of a cut and dry thing to look at is, does your community have explicit policies around non-retaliation for feedback? And our hope again is that within the coming weeks, we can have sort of some templates for what that might look like. I'm sure that there are some communities who have versions of this that you feel pretty confident or good about, or individual agencies or providers. If you do, we'd love to have you share them with us so that we can share them with other folks. But I'll pause here and would love to hear what questions are coming up in the chat. And Garen, anything you'd add here?
Caitlin's questions.
Well, we had a really great question in the chat from Ian in Denver about, especially during the pandemic and during the era of COVID-19, how can we go about meaningfully collecting qualitative data? And I thought I might pick on Romina, if she's on and amenable to it, to tell us how we did it, because we actually conducted some focus groups during the pandemic, and a lot of the feedback that we got really meaningfully informed these indicators. So I wonder if I might pick on her. Are you there, Romina?
Hi, I am here. Hi, I'm happy to just quickly walk through a little bit about what we did with the focus groups. Essentially, I'm not going to lie, it was difficult. It was hard to do this work, but we knew that we needed to do it. What we did was I worked really closely with the transformers in those communities. So Candace, Tamara, and Callie in Detroit, Phoenix, and Washington, D.C., who are on the ground. Because me, as someone who's not local, difficult to do that work. And we worked by contacting providers who interact with people experiencing homelessness or who have recently experienced homelessness, and also just talked to folks that we knew who were experiencing homelessness, because we had some connections just with people. We asked them if they would want to be a participant in these groups to talk with us about our draft measurement framework. And of course, we offered payment for their work with us. And in order to do those focus groups, so what we did was we set up a mechanism wherein people could either join via computer or via phone to work through these really kind of complex things we were talking about. So we created several handouts to send to participants beforehand so that people could talk with us on the phone, so that they didn't have to have access to the internet or a computer, because that's always that can always be a problem. And then others who could join us on the phone, we had an interactive way of doing this work with a virtual whiteboard. So we just did as much as we could to meet folks truly where they are, and allow this really needed feedback and participation as much as we could in this kind of like limited space that we were in. But yeah, I'm happy to answer other questions on that, but that's essentially like the bare bones of how we did those focus groups. So yeah, I'd love to know your feedback on that too.
Hey, Caitlin,
Cool.
I would just like to back on something and say that no providers were allowed to participate during those focus groups. So there was some freedom, and there was a lot of space for individuals to talk freely, because there was no one there but Romina and the transformer.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so I think sort of extrapolating out, some of what we might want to encourage folks to do is to think about how you can leverage partners in your community, right, to provide that sort of one degree of separation so that folks feel more comfortable showing up authentically. There's really good chat happening around trust and the importance of trust. But I wanted to speak to Kiana's question as well, because I think it's crucial. And we should have said this out loud. It's on the page explicitly. But that this is not a sort of race blind people with lived experience feedback exercise, right? That we actually, it matters the demographic representation of the folks that we're getting this feedback from. And so that I'd encourage you all to also, a place to start is to think about, in addition to the feedback, what demographic information can we collect in a sensitive way, in a sort of user-centric way, so that we can better understand whose voice are we hearing here? And as importantly, whose voice are we not hearing in this feedback?
Something I wanted to, so just like an observation I had from like Romina and Candace, what you guys shared, it takes work. Like it's like a lot. It takes a whole, you basically have to like build a whole little system to make sure that you can access people and co-design with them in a meaningful way. Like I don't know, it's like a whole project and a whole like it's a whole like body of work. I think that like and that leads me to kind of like a second insight. So like that's an observation that it like takes a lot of work. It takes like just sort of a lot of effort to make sure it's done more meaningfully. But with that observation, what is a way to kind of improve that? What is a way to kind of make it into a foregone conclusion that you have this information that that it doesn't take as much work, and you're still getting the same sort of high quality like and like meaningful co-design from people with lived experience? Like what's a way to turn that into like just the way your system is?
It's a great provocation. And some of the way that I think about this is the first time that you're off-roading, you're paving a new road, it's a lot of work, right? You have to do a lot of stakeholder engagement. You have to create a bunch of new processes. You have to learn some new skills. There's training involved. But then I think it gets easier over time, right? You can build off of the foundation that you lay. And so I think that our hope is that first, we can look to see where those foundations might already exist in communities. I think I am definitely someone who's guilty sometimes of thinking, all right, we've got a plan, let's get after it, before pausing for a beat and thinking, who in the community has already done a version of this? Where are the sort of local experts who I could be tapping into and leaning on? And so I think that that's some of our learning as well. I saw a question in the chat about, what's sort of the top line takeaway from those focus groups? And I know Romina's on the call, so I'll take a stab at this, and then Romina and Candace, I would love if y'all wanted to come in and layer on some of your context as well. I want to name here that there was hundreds of pages of transcripts from those focus groups that our team sort of did a deep dive synthesis on. And I think for me, at least, what I heard was two big themes are focusing on dignity, right? Preserving dignity as being so crucial that, again, it's not about satisfaction as much as sort of what the folks are saying about the lived experience of receiving services or engaging with these systems. And then timeliness. And I think this was really interesting for me to hear, because I think we often look at an average length of time measure, right? Which is important. I'm not saying that it's not valuable to look at it, but can we start to disaggregate that and start to get curious about who are the folks, who are the 10 people, let's say, who have the longest length of time engaging in our system, or where there's the longest sort of lag time between people engaging in services and they're having their needs met. And so some of this is about taking things that we are already measuring, and we'll talk more about this soon, and unpacking them to understand, is that average really representative of everybody's experience, or are there sort of differentiations here when we disaggregate by race, ethnicity, other groups? But Romina or Candace, I'd love to hear what else you guys might add.
I think just one of the main takeaways, and Aras, I think you covered this pretty well, was that the experience of homelessness, and we talk about dignity here, my dog's making noise, so sorry, is that the experience of homelessness is not just otherizing, but it's dehumanizing. I mean, that is just like really the word for it here. And it was brought up over and over and over again, that people experiencing homelessness are not viewed as actual human beings, and that it is our responsibility to correct that societally, and also to do our best to just like work on our own ourselves in order to correct that kind of mentality. And I think that this measure, this indicator, is really our attempt to start doing that. And yes, thank you for the good afternoon to my dog. Yes, I appreciate it.
And I think, Araz, I would add something you talked about earlier before you even started your presentation. A lot of the individuals we talked to, and they were from various backgrounds, white, Black, trans individuals. We talked to a lot of individuals. And housing, of course, was very important to them, but there were a lot of other extenuating circumstances that led into that housing piece. So when we deal with someone, what we may think is focal is not as focal to them. Even though they need housing, they're dealing with whether or not they're going to jail tomorrow or not, or they're so multifaceted. And so sometimes we have to make sure that we are taking that picture, a whole picture of an individual. So, they were individuals, and that's what came across to us. It wasn't just homelessness. It was, I'm a person and I have the same problems or situations that you have.
Yes, couldn't agree more. And so as we think about, what does that mean for some of the ways that we might try and change some things about how we're understanding the experience of people engaging in the homeless response system or engaging with it. I think we want to keep those things in mind. And maybe some of the learning for me is that it might be hard to start narrow and targeted, right? I think especially if your community is operating in a space where there isn't already deep collaboration with folks with lived experience of homelessness, it might make sense to start. We often use sort of the model, and I think most of you are probably familiar with it, about sort of open brainstorming, then narrowing, then closing, making a decision. And I think sometimes it's helpful to just name, hey, with regards to getting feedback from folks with lived experience at the homeless system level, not program or project level, we're in the open, right? We want to take some of our assumptions about what's in scope and out of scope, and maybe hit pause on bringing those to the table in conversation with folks with lived experience of homelessness or people who are currently experiencing homelessness, and just provide an opportunity for a more expansive conversation. I think that was something that we benefited from. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think maybe I'll move us to a quick temperature check on this. So we'd love to hear how this is landing for you and the extent to which you feel like your community is already implementing, measuring, and tracking some measure related to the lived experience of folks engaging in your systems. So again, it looks like there's a big old range here, but it's always energizing to see that there are sort of folks who we can learn from as well, some 4s and 5s in the chat. I suspect that's going to be true the whole way through. So, Karen, anything you'd add here?
I mean, all I'd add is that, like, maybe I see from my like armchair statistician's analysis, it looks like the numbers are a little lower on this one. If I were to like maybe pop out an average, and I think that's cool. That's good to know. That's good to know that people are kind of like thinking about this one, maybe struggling with it a little bit.
Okay, so I think we're going to move out of a slightly more qualitative space into something that's a little more familiar for all of us. So the next indicator is related to quality data. And really what this boils down to is that all people experiencing homelessness have access to the system and are known by name in real time. So let me put that a different way, which is, does your by name list include everybody in your community, regardless of their race and ethnicity, right? And then specifically, do we have availability or access to data around people's race and ethnicity, and is that data any good, right? And I think one of the big learnings coming out of the Spark research was that, particularly for some communities where there are big, varied populations, right? Some of the categories or labels aren't really working for folks, right? And we'll talk more about that in a second. So I think some of how we think you could measure this, right, is using something like our by name list scorecard framework. And so we're in the process of adding some dimensions explicitly to that tool so that folks sort of, as they're thinking about getting to quality data for all single adults experiencing homelessness or veterans or people experiencing chronic homelessness or youth or families, they're walking through these questions about coverage and real-time updates and enacted policies, and should also be thinking about whether staff are demonstrating best practices to mitigate racial bias in their data, how that data is being collected. So is it respecting self-identification? And what we mean by self-identification here is, I think y'all have all interacted with some kind of government form or standard form where there are these census categories, right? And it's, African-American, Asian, white, and so on down the line. And I'll just speak from personal experience. None of those boxes feel representative to me of what I think of as my race and ethnicity, right? And I think that is true for lots of folks, right? Not to say that those aren't meaningful distinctions for HUD or other folks to use, but that as we're collecting the data locally, we might want to give people a more expansive list of options, or maybe, and it's a bit of a pain in the butt, I'll just say, from a data collection and administration perspective, is there an opportunity to just have a blank line, right? And let folks say, I'm Haitian American, right? And then we on the back end can sort of say, how does that map to these categories, right? And so that's some of the thinking here. Obviously, again, that's some additional work for the data folks in your community. But then lastly, thinking about how that data is being collected, right? And whether or not we have some high degree of confidence in it, and how complete is it, right? So I think a big aha moment for me was working with a community, and they had, a quality by name list, but the race and especially the ethnicity sort of columns in their by name list were pretty shaky. And so as we started to look at it, there were like a lot of unknowns in there, and that's a flag, right? That's a flag about data collection. That's a conversation and an opportunity for improvement. So then once you have that quality data in your system, once you can say yes to sort of these different facets of what might be scorecard questions, I think the next piece of the puzzle is actually using that data to visualize and share just that information disaggregated by race and ethnicity. And so I think a big learning for us on the, just the improvement work around reductions in homelessness has been, you can get all your ducks in a row in terms of folks entering data into HMIS, but then there's a completely separate conversation about whether or not we can get that data out and into a usable format and visualized and look at it over time, right? And anybody who's been part of the Built for Zero work for a while knows that there's this sort of separate process that data leads or other folks in the community are doing to take some of that raw data and turn it into something that's accessible to the broader community. And so we'll be talking more about that and thinking about ways that the Built for Zero team can support you. But this is sort of what we were thinking about as the ways that you would measure whether you have quality data in this way. And again, I think the place to start is to look at your by name list. Look at what % of individuals have race and ethnicity fields completed, right? Is your community one of those where this is fairly complete, or do you have a lot of unknowns in there? And then, maybe just gut checking with some frontline staff. Do we feel like this data is right? Or is this something that is a little more iffy or shaky on the process, right? And I know there's a big variation from agency to agency, provider to provider, program to program. And so it might be starting to look at locally, how is this data getting there, right? Is it an intake form? Who's filling the form out? Is it the individual experiencing homelessness or a case manager or an intake staff person, right? Are the folks being asked about their race and ethnicity? What do we have in terms of language availability, right? I think I want to name here specifically that ethnicity, sort of Latinidad or Hispanic status is something that often isn't intuitive to people, right? You might say, I'm a Mexican American. What's my race and what's my ethnicity? Am I a white person of Hispanic origin, right? That probably doesn't feel intuitive to everybody in your community. And so sort of circling back to think about, how do we talk about this with folks experiencing homelessness who we're hoping to get this information from? If we have written resources, are they accessible? Is there an opportunity here again to engage different stakeholders, folks with lived experience, to think about whether or not the ways that we're collecting this information is working? And then is there an opportunity for folks to self-identify and then to put the burden of sort of the coding or the matching how somebody self-identifies to categories on the system rather than on the individual in the moment, right? And I think that has been sort of a bright spot or a learning for us as we've talked to a lot of different communities about what's working is it seems like the data quality is much higher or greatly improved, right? When we give people the opportunity to do that sort of more granular, less formulaic demographic report out. But I'll pause there. Garen or Caitlin, anything you'd add here? Or Ramina, anyone on the team about some of our learning and initial thoughts about where to start? Okay. Any questions coming up in the chat, Caitlin, or any questions that you've got for us to speak to this?
There's some really great questions happening in the chat right now. So I'll just pull one of them for us to start with, which is how do we show the value of collecting this data to clients?
Yeah, it's a crucial question. To me, I think this sort of ties back to the bigger picture why and how we talk to folks with lived experience about the work that we're doing, right? Which is to say, I think we have to have this is not data collection for admiring the problem, right? This is data collection in service of improvement. And so I think that, you know, a good thing to come to the table with is here's an example, right, of one chart or one metric that we're hoping to disaggregate by race and ethnicity, right? So in my community, I know that the average length of time for veterans experiencing homelessness from when they first touch the system to when they move into a safe and stable housing opportunity is 100 days. But I know that that's probably not true for everybody in our system. And this data is the way in which we're going to help understand and hold the system accountable for whether or not everybody is having that same level of support or services from the system. And I think, like, obviously there's upfront work to do to get buy-in because you don't want to overpromise, right? That we're going to be able to actually react to the data. And so all of these are related in a way. But I think that my story is that, you know, just thinking about basic experiences we all have, right? If an airline asks me to fill out a survey, if I don't know what they're going to do with it, they have to incentivize me with like a raffle or something. I think that if you feel like you have to use a raffle, you've already lost, right? You haven't done a good enough job of explaining the why behind it. So I think that is my story, but I'd be curious. I feel like I just want to pick on Garen and Ramina here to see what y'all think and might add.
I think something that like you're kind of, something that I kind of hear behind your answer, Aras, that I want to kind of like bring forward is that, like, I think this, in order to explain the why, that means like being frank about racism with people with lived experience, or I don't know, like being frank about racism and the role that your system plays in perpetuating racism and perpetuating white supremacy. Because like at the end of the day, that is really what it's about. It's about like, we are acknowledging that our system does not serve everybody equally. And in order to solve that problem, in order to have data for improvement, we need to, I don't know, we have to know the scope of the problem so that we can improve it.
Totally. And Darren, I think that actually feeds into this next question really well, which is folks are wondering, what are some of the decisions that this data would help you make as you house clients? And I think we're sort of already hitting on that, but I wonder if you might expound upon it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to say, I think I don't know the answer. And I think that, but I bet there are a lot of people who maybe know the answer. And I would also say that, like, I don't know, I might just go down like a platitude hole if I keep talking. So maybe like somebody else knows the answer and they should talk.
So I think there are two things that I can say. The first is that honestly, some of the value of this is at the system level and not at the individual level, right? So we can just name that as something that's true. But I do think at the individual level, especially if we go the self-identification route, I have one anecdote that has stuck with me about some of the shortcomings of our off-the-shelf categories, right? So generally, in a community, those standard census categories are Black African-American is a single category. And I have an experience where I was working in a community that had a big sort of African-American population, but also a big refugee population of folks from Haiti and the Caribbean. both of those folks are going to show up on your standard HMIS report as Black, right? Black African American. But the reality was that the Haitian folks had a completely distinct set of needs that were refugee specific. There were a complete different set of agencies that we could have been engaging as partners in case management, right? Refugee resettlement services, community organizations, translators for Haitian Creole, right? So just at the individual level, as I put myself in the position of a case manager or a case conferencing meeting, right? Knowing definitively, right, some more specifics about somebody's background and demographics are going to tee us up to do that more meaningful, deep work of thinking about how we can best serve that person experiencing homelessness. And so for me, I don't want to put too sharp a point on it, but some of those off-the-shelf categories really obscure some meaningful, crucial information. To say nothing of if we don't have that data at all, right? If it's unknown, then we know even less. So that's sort of my read on it, but be curious if anyone else on the team or not, if anyone from a community has an answer here about ways that you've seen that data be valuable in serving individuals experiencing homelessness.
We actually have some great examples that are coming up in the chat. So Temu has identified that knowing race ethnicity data can help you tailor your outreach to be culturally appropriate and informed. There was another one that I just lost.
Hey, Caitlin, if I could just remark on something Aras said. I think it's so important what you said. We just had a gentleman, and I think our case person is on this call now, and we were trying to house him, and we were having some difficulties because we really weren't looking at his ethnicity the way we should have. He was having a very hard time working with the case manager he was working with. We just weren't getting any help with him. We found out from someone who said this person needs to work with this type of person because they understand culturally what this person needs. And since we've been able to move that in that direction, he seems to be responding better. We seem to be getting better out. We're a lot more confident that we're going to be able to move him now than what we were before, because we did not have our eyes on what we should have been thinking about. We just lump people, and we just need to stop doing that. I think you gave a great example.
Thanks, Candace. And I know in the chat, folks are also saying, there might be an opportunity as well to think about in the moment as folks are, it seems like there's an example from partners in Canada where as folks are self-identifying as Indigenous, there's an opportunity to ask if they'd feel more comfortable having an Indigenous person as their case manager, right? Or their intake staff. And so, not that that's always going to be an option on the table in terms of capacity and staffing, but we can, again, start to think about the ways that we can accommodate folks in a more thoughtful way. So I think that's sort of the quick nutshell. Anything else folks would add here? I think that of the parts of our system, my hunch is this is one where we have a lot of expertise already in communities, but that there might be some tightening up of the nuts and bolts and screws where it's worth checking in. I think one of the things that astounds people every time I talk to them about the work that we do is they say, so there's a Department of Homeless Services in the community and they're centralized and they do it. And I say, no. We've got a constellation of agencies and service providers that's totally decentralized in most of our communities, right? Obviously, we have the continuum of care umbrella, but I think as we think about this, it's likely that even within your community, there's a big range in terms of training and capacity and process. And so some of the work here, I think, starts with discovery, just checking in. What is the status quo at all of the different places where people are touching the system or where we're doing that data collection? What does that look like, right? And can we sort of establish a standard and think about raising the bar where possible? Okay, so maybe here I'll move us and Garen, I'll ask you to be Garen or Caitlin, our temperature check.
Open your mouths, under the tongue. Say ah, give us a number. Some 4s, some 2s and 3s. I was maybe anticipating that, like, since folks, this seems like one that folks may have had a head start on just because of, I don't know, some frameworks that are already available or systems that already ask for this information. So yeah, I see a lot of 4s.
Great. My hunch is that this is also a place.
2.89. Perfect.
Perfect. My hunch is that this is
Perfectly
also
calibrated.
a place where we can hit the ground running in a lot of our communities for some improvement work. So whereas some of these other parts of your system are going to involve some deep collaboration and design, I think that there's a little bit more desk research, so to speak, that you can do, especially in this remote environment on this front, in just checking in on policies and procedures and checking in on, honestly, the data quality in your by name list as the place to start. Okay, I'll keep us moving. So the fourth and final indicator is really a companion to that quality data, right? Which is, what are the system performance metrics that we think, once you have that quality data, what might we want to look at, right? So all of y'all are obviously familiar through Built for Zero with looking at your actively homeless number, some inflow categories, some outflow categories. And really the indicator here is about closing racial and ethnic disproportionality in 3 of those categories or metrics. So in housing placements, returns to homelessness, and the average length of time from identification to housing. And this second sentence here about improving outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, it's really just saying, let's say that we look at our system performance metrics and there's a gap there between different demographic categories. We want to make it super explicit that the way we close the gap is to raise the floor for everybody. It's not by lowering the ceiling, right? So it's not to say, hey, actually, maybe we'll sort of, not intentionally, obviously, but we'll close the gap by getting everybody closer to the average. It's like, we got to keep the peoples who are experiencing really positive outcomes up here and bring everybody else up closer to that threshold, if that makes sense. And that's probably obvious to all of you, but I think some of the feedback we heard as we talked through this framework with other stakeholders was, well, wouldn't one way that you could game the system be to just reduce the average outcomes for everybody? And we said, that is true. I don't think anyone's going to do that, but let's just name that explicitly. Let's take the air out of that. The 2 ways that you might measure this are first, analyzing, and here we suggest using that intersectional lens, considering things like gender identity, age, sexual orientation. I would layer on here even region, if you're a big geographic area, right? We know that one thing that's relevant is, where are people accessing the system? So lay all your data out on a table and start to look at what your baselines are and identify where there might be that disproportionality, right? So are there certain groups of individuals or households that have a much longer length of time, or that have a much lower housing placement exit rate, or that have a much higher rate of return to homelessness? And then you sort of close the gap, right, in outcomes for populations for those 3 metrics over time. So maybe here, I'll just hum a few bars about why these 3 things. Why not look at inflow or inactives? I think we'll just start by saying, a lot of the feedback we got on this is that sometimes it can feel like you're drowning in data and signal, right? So once you start to think about looking at those 7 indicators, let's just say for veterans or people experiencing chronic homelessness by different race and ethnicity categories, it can start to feel like, whoa, now I'm looking at 30 data points where before I was looking at 7. So we're trying to sort of narrow focus down. And these were 3 areas in particular that were flagged, both from our partners at C4 and the Spark study, and honestly in conversation with people with lived experience, as indicators of system performance that felt meaningful to folks. Inflow obviously is something that is massively impacted by those upstream systems. And so since we're trying to focus our energy and attention on the performance of the homeless response system, we wanted to narrow the scope of our focus. Not to say that those are not important indicators, they 100% are. And we encourage y'all to work with upstream partners on thinking about disproportionality and inflow. It's just not a part of this specific framework and set of indicators. And I think that length of time piece, again, what we heard from folks with lived experience is that timeliness in services felt like one of their stated measures of whether or not their experience was a positive one with the homeless response system. And so that's sort of why that measure still feels really crucial. So I think the place to start here is by exploring your data, right? The good news is that, you know, even a couple of years ago when we started to get in conversation with communities, it felt like most of us had the ability to do this, to pull that data and look at it and identify disproportionality or get curious about it. I think the one learning that we've had is that just looking at race and ethnicity in a vacuum, obviously, is gonna, again, shortchange that broader, richer story. And so just knowing that, you know, a young adult is gonna have a very different experience of your system than somebody who's 65, right? Age is super crucial, and so is gender identity and so on down the line. And so the more granular that we can get in that preliminary analysis to understand who our systems are serving better and who's having sort of disproportionately worse outcomes within our system, the more targeted we can be in our interventions. So that was one of the learnings for us, was getting targeted. And then y'all may have heard of this sort of term, targeted universalism, this idea of once we identify the folks that the system is working the worst for, focusing in and narrowing down to just say, what would it look like to focus improvement projects on moving the needle for that group? And then month over month, we don't have to look at all of that big sea of overwhelming data. We can just narrow the focus on that target group and think about shrinking the gap or improving outcomes for that group. So again, I think the place to start here, and our team is excited to be able to support you with this in the days ahead, is to just do that preliminary analysis. I think there are lots of other stakeholders, you know, NIH, HUD, other folks who have some tools and ways to start to engage with this. But I would recommend that once you've identified that target group who's experiencing those disproportionately negative outcomes from the system, then let's just narrow our focus and think about what it would look like to improve outcomes for that group, knowing that it's going to raise the bar, generally speaking, for everybody. So I'll pause there. Anything you'd add, Garen or Caitlin, here before we open it up to questions?
I want to like preview a little image that I have on a slide coming up, and that's like the job of the improvement job description is to get curious. And that's what I think that's what the invitation is right now, is to just be super curious about your data and where the disproportionalities might exist.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the work is going to be in figuring that out, right? So I think that like looking at the data is the easy part. Moving the needle on the data is what's going to be the hard work. And I think we have some learning there as well, right? But that's where we're, I think, going to really, in the same way that we're doing this work for reductions in overall homelessness, we're learning from one another, testing different interventions, seeing if they move the needle. I think there's going to be the same type of approach here. And I think they're going to be interconnected. I saw a sort of a question in the chat about, you know, whether we have the data to do that intersectional analysis. So this is just another place that I'll just put in a plug for gut checking that quality data, right? So we know that things like gender identity or sexual orientation can often be places where our data sets are pretty incomplete. And so just naming that as something that we aren't able to do today, and then maybe thinking about how we can get better at doing it tomorrow. Same as the race and ethnicity data, same as I know for some communities, sort of more granular data about age or other things may also not always be at the table when we're doing these kind of analyses. Not to say we don't have it on file, but you know, we just lump some people into categories of under 25, 25 to 55, 55 plus, and there would be a story that you're missing by doing that. So my encouragement is to put all the data on the table where possible, to really get disaggregated and granular for that first analysis, and just know that that is not an everyday analysis, right? I think that we've seen a lot of success when folks say, we're going to do a really deep dive and feel comfortable knowing that we're going to do it again in 6 months, right? And then in that 6-month period, we're going to focus on improvement rather than a really cumbersome measurement process. And so that's some of the mental model we're working with today, but I think we're going to learn into this more together.
There's a lot of activity in the chat about people being so excited to get started on doing this work, which is so encouraging to see. And speaking of previewing, Garen, I wonder if there is in this learning session even maybe some education about how we can respond to inequities in our data. Would that be like a dream on a star that I could make come true?
OMG, wish granted.
Yay! Yes, our next session, I think directly after this, is going to be a whole session with Donald and our improvement advisor from Phoenix, Shantae, about responding to inequities in your data. So if you are planning on joining us for that, then you will get to dive a little bit deeper into how you can respond to inequities that you see in your data, especially as you consider these indicators. If you weren't planning on coming to it before, perhaps plan on coming to it now if we've piqued your interest. But I wanted to preview that that's coming for those of you who are getting really excited to start doing the work.
It's a great plug. And I'll just say, it seems like there's some dialogue in the chat also about how do we structure the data in a meaningful way, and then how do we get it in the hands of the right folks who are able to react and respond to it, making sure that policy and decision-making is informed by that data. And I think those are two areas that our team is really interested in learning and supporting communities in the days ahead. So it's great to see that. Any other questions emerging out of the chat or Caitlin that you think it'd be helpful for us to speak to?
Yeah, I'm thinking something that might be helpful for us to think about or to talk about with the group is what our expectations are for communities moving forward as we start to look at these system indicators. Is this going to be something that shows up on our scorecard every month? How are we planning on working together on these indicators?
That's a great question. Garen, you want to start and I'll chime in?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that right now, I see our main coaching role as a thought partnership role. I think we're interested in getting curious with you and helping you figure out how to get curious. I think that's how maybe I see my role. If someone were to come to me and bring up these indicators on a coaching call, that's where I would start. Is what do you know? How can you know more? How can you kind of close your knowledge gap? And that's where we would begin.
Yep, that sounds right to me. And I think we are in the process of building out some more concrete data infrastructure and tools. We'll talk more about that in a second, sort of the support that the Built for Zero team is cooking up. But the hope would be that eventually, the same way that we have a set of dashboards and an approach to helping folks visualize reductions month over month or progress towards functional zero, we can also have some way to help you guys display in a standard way, right? I think some of the value of this kind of framework is an apples to apples comparison across communities, right? As a way to start to get in conversation and do goal setting and be rowing in the same direction and to feel like the movement is rowing in that direction too. And so we'll have a lot more of that to come. So I think with that, maybe we can do a quick temperature check on these system outcomes. My hunch is that this is another place where we're going to see some high scores. I know just in conversation with communities, some folks are already looking at this, and I think where we're at in some communities is, all right, we see these disproportionalities, now what do we do about them? Right? But I know that's not true everywhere, and so I'd love to hear how this is looking for you. And maybe a second thing to consider here is, are there parts of your system where we can do this, right? So can we do this for veterans, but not all single adults? Or can we do this for people experiencing chronic homelessness, but not yet for youth or families? So I think that's just another way for us to start to think about our system capacity here.
And maybe even
got a good range.
Thinking about granularity in even a different way, can we do this for inflow, but not for housing placements? Can we do this with length of time from identification to assessment, but not for other sort of horizontal aspects of your coordinated entry system?
And thank you so much for saying that, Garen. I think that length of time measure is just another one where I think we can get into the nitty gritty and see some more powerful observations and opportunities for improvement, right? So if we take your homeless response system and chunk it out into, those blocks of coordinated entry, so access and assessment and matching and so on, right? Whatever that looks like locally to you, whatever your coordinated entry flow and process map is, digging into the length of time there is going to be really powerful as well. Awesome. Okay, so these are our 4 indicators. Again, as I mentioned, we'll share these slides, but we'll also share a PDF version of this that I think can be a helpful sort of 2-page reference document to share with stakeholders in your community. So those metrics are, or those indicators are system decision-making power, lived experience, quality data, and system outcomes. And again, I think for most of us, this is nothing new, right? I don't want to claim that we've created the wheel for the first time. This is really an exercise in pulling together learning that's happening in all of your communities and from different stakeholders, and trying to package it to say, we think that if you could move the needle in a meaningful way on all 4 of these indicators, you're going to have some meaningful progress towards equity in your community. And not to say that this is the end all be all. Again, obviously we'll continue to evolve and learn and grow. But that is a place to start. These are 4 domains in which you might want to focus your attention and some ideas about how to do that. So what support can you expect from the Built for Zero team? So we have sort of 4, when we started to think about how our team could show up to support racial equity in this space, we came up with sort of 4 main drivers or places we could exert our energy and attention. The first is the framework that we just walked through together. It's a way to set community-wide goals, build the will for difficult conversations, track and measure progress. The next is data tools and dashboards, right? So that's some of the way we already show up, supporting y'all with a way to look at and understand month-over-month data. And so we're cooking up some ways to do something similar around racial equity and these measures that we just walked through. Stay tuned for that. I think it'll be happening over the next month or 2. There'll be opportunities to start to engage and use those tools. Then there's coaching and training, and I'll pass it over to Garen to speak to his beautiful improver job description diagram.
It is not mine. I stole it. And I'm going to give credit. It comes from our partners at IHI. This was shared at, this was a flip chart at an IHI summit, I believe last year. So yeah, improver job description, get curious. It's the only line item. So yeah, what questions are you asking? I think that's what we're most interested in right now from a coaching perspective, is just kind of being thought partners and helping you get started and helping you kind of frame the right question. What are some things that you're curious about, and what are some next steps that help us get curious? And also there's more to come. We're still sort of developing what coaching will look like in kind of a racial equity context. And so, yeah, there's more to come, more concrete things coming down the pike.
Absolutely. And I'll just name that, even you'll see reflected in today and yesterday, an intention to tap into expertise that we know exists in the sector and outside of it around issues of racial equity. So I think I just want to name here that we are conscious that on a lot of these topics, there is expertise. We don't have to cultivate it on the Built for Zero team. Instead, we'd rather connect y'all with sort of the best thinking that's out there. And so we'll continue to plan to do that. And then lastly, I think just conversations like this one. So peer learning and knowledge sharing. So as mentioned earlier, as we go and dig into this, I think we are asking y'all to share with your coaches what's working, what's not, what bright spots or things you've already figured out locally that you might be able to share. And then our commitment is to document those, to sort of give them a look over, and then to share them out widely with everybody so that we're all learning together, and that nobody has to feel like you've got to figure this out on your own in your community. And I think that can be really powerful. And our hope is that as we start to build momentum in each of your communities, in that startup phase, if you're in that startup phase locally, you feel like you have a bench of co-conspirators, of teammates, right? Even if they're not in your local community, that you can tap in conversations here and to learn from and with. And then we've got a couple online resources that we'll link to as well. So I think most of you are hopefully familiar with what we call the change package. It's sort of a knowledge base or set of ideas and an evidence base that we're constantly building and adding to. And so we've got a start for that knowledge base related to racial equity. It's early days still, right? in terms of an evidence base in our sector. But we're going to continue to point to resources there, and then obviously continue to draw also on resources that y'all are developing locally, things that are out there developed by partners in the space as well. So we'll continue learning together. All right. I think we've got a couple minutes here before we close. Just any big picture questions, things that are coming up for folks as we've walked through this framework.
Just quickly before we dive into that, Ross, I would be very remiss to not plug that there are actually 2 sessions that are coming up next. One is, of course, the responding to inequities in your data, and the other one is actually about involving people with lived experience in your system. Oh, you already have that. I just wanted to make sure that I plugged both of them so that way people didn't think that there was only one session coming up next. So great, I will hold on that so that way you guys can properly intro it.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah.
This is Carissa in Denver, and I was wondering if the Built for Zero team has made any progress on specific metrics and looking at, I think I saw one of the bullets was like housing placement. In an equitable system, what would racially equitable housing placements look like? Like, I know we're looking for disparity, knowing to try to identify the issue, but do we have metrics identified that says, when your placements equal, whatever, your system is performing equitably or housing people equitably, like things like that? Are there metrics coming, or would they be relative to our community?
Yeah, so I think that's a really excellent question. Where we're at right now is thinking about this, as you said, in terms of the local population of people experiencing homelessness. So let me put that a slightly different way. Could we look at your housing placements and break them down by type, right? So let's just think about rapid rehousing exits, and then look at the pool of people who are receiving that intervention relative to the people who are sort of scoring in that prioritization range, or maybe just relative to the overall population, because I do think there's a conversation here as well that we're going to need to dig into in terms of prioritization policies and how we think about acuity, right? And how we make decisions about resource allocation. So I think that's where the hard work happens. I think I'll just name that from a data nerd perspective, some of what we're grappling with, right, is that there's going to be some variation, right? You're never going to be at that perfect equilibrium. I think that there's like a analog here for me to functional zero, right, versus a hard zero. So how do we bake in the understanding that in communities, there are going to be moments where there is some disproportionality, and not to say that that's okay, but that it's expected, right? And I think we don't yet have our arms around how you can sort of measure that or pin that down concretely. But I think we know what good looks like or better looks like, and it looks like less disproportionality overall. And I think we'll learn into the specifics of what that concrete end state that we hope to ideally drive towards is going to look like. Does that make sense? I know that's like a partial answer, but I do think that we can start to scaffold out how you might look at specifically housing placements as an example, and think about the extent to which there's disproportionality and whether the disproportionality is being used.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I know we've just got a couple minutes left in this session. I don't know if Tamara or Anna, one of our wonderful MCs, want to jump on and just, again, talk through the rest of today and what folks can expect.
Yes. So coming up next, we're going to have a 15-minute break. Then we're going to have our breakouts that are coming online, the partnership and collaboration with people with lived experience and responding to inequity in your data. Then another 15-minute break. And then we have the understanding and improving experience of Black and Indigenous people and other people of color who interact with our homelessness systems. And then we're doing a team debrief. And so those team debriefs are on your own. And if you've set something up locally, maybe a Zoom line, just make sure that you're emailing everyone so you can debrief and use that reflection document and kind of work through what we've learned today. But other than that, we've got a 15-minute break. So everybody should come back about 10:45. And don't forget
Thanks, y'all.
eval. Yeah. Thank you.